Chapter 53. Dusty the Booker. In November of 1988, Fritz Von Erich sold World Class to that hillbilly from Tennessee, Jarrett. Eric Embry was actually the one who brokered the deal with Jarrett, because for some odd reason he really wanted to go to Tennessee, and thought it was the heaven of all heavens. Fritz sold to Jarrett simply because he was at his wits' end. Ken Mantell, who once again took over the book when I left, had let him down for a second time with his bad booking decisions. After Jarrett bought it, World Class was over, and the name simply became a tool to make Jarrett's promotion, the USWA, seem superior. And in August of 1989, I came home from a tour, and my boys told me that World Class had finally been put to rest for good. Apparently, on the World Class Championship Wrestling TV show, Eric Embry tore the World Class banner down and replaced it with a USWA banner. Even though it was something that I had helped create and took great pride in, I really didn't care who bought it or what they wanted to call it. I was just thankful that no one could diminish or stomp on the World Class name any longer. After the sale of World Class, Ken Mantell was out of the wrestling business for good, branded a complete failure. He had failed in his attempt to destroy World Class in 1986, he failed as the booker in the UWF, he failed with his Wild West promotion in 1987, and he failed so badly when he booked World Class in 1988 that Fritz had to sell the company. Yet, after all that, Ken somehow managed to worm his way back into Bill Watts' life and, just as he did with Sam Cohen, convinced Bill to be the sole investor in a vitamin business so they could be equal partners. They even moved to Australia together to start their new venture, where Ken stole money from Bill by bilking him for a large sum of cash in a sleazy scheme. Ken Mantell has no moral center whatsoever. He would say anything he had to say and do anything he had to do in order to get what he wanted, even if it meant betraying his friends, and he would just hope he could slide by and no one would notice. Friendships in the wrestling business are a strange thing, though. Fritz Von Erich was a very close and longtime friend of Ken Mantell, and look at the vindictive way Ken screwed him over in 1986 when he left him high and dry. That, of course, begs the question as to how Bill Watts could trust Ken with one red cent after he saw firsthand what he did to Fritz, and it can only be answered by one word: ego. Ego can prevent many people from having the success that they should have, because they figure that since they're the smartest one in the room, there is no way anyone could screw them over and do them any harm. Fritz was same way, though, and I'm certainly not implying that Ken was smarter than Bill or Fritz, because he wasn't. It's just that Bill and Fritz's egos led them to see Ken Mantell as merely secondary talent, which he was, and they never in their wildest dreams believed that Ken could cause them the aggravation and problems that he eventually did. The warning signs were clearly there, especially for Bill Watts. The reason I was so successful as a booker was because I kept my eyes open, watched what was going on around me, always paid attention, and never relied on stooges. A lot of times when someone attains a powerful position, they get into a situation where they are no longer in the real world, and only know what people tell them, and those people are usually just kissing their ass or working them for their own agenda. Ironically, in November of 1988, the same month that Fritz sold World Class to Jarrett, Jimmy Crockett sold his wrestling company to Ted Turner. I've heard many bad things about Jimmy Crockett, and none of them ring true. If Jimmy did have one major fault, it's that he was too generous in the amount of money he paid his talent, including me. However, the WWF was raiding every promotion they could, so Jimmy panicked and started signing guys like Ric Flair, the Road Warriors, Sting, and Lex Luger to long-term contracts at exorbitant salaries. Jimmy Crockett simply overextended himself trying to protect his talent pool, and that's what caused the downfall of Crockett Promotions. Jimmy Crockett also gets a lot of flack for flying us all over the country in a Lear jet, but nobody seems to realize that the reason he flew his crew on private planes was so that we wouldn't have to stand in lines at airports. People also point to the scheduling of the flights as if they made no sense. For example, we would leave Charlotte and fly to Philadelphia. The next day we were scheduled to be in Baltimore, but rather than stay over, we would fly back to Charlotte, and then fly back to Baltimore the next day. The only reason we flew back and forth to Charlotte after every show was because Jimmy wanted us to be home with our families. He also arranged for limos to pick us up when the planes landed to take us wherever we wanted so we wouldn't have to wait or have any stresses during our travels. Believe me when I tell you, Crockett Promotions went broke in the most honorable way a company can go. And the same be said about other promoters, and the way their companies went out of business. When Bill Watts had to sell off his UWF, was it because he overspent on his talent? Anyone who worked for him knows the answer to that. The Crocketts were always the most gracious people that I ever worked for. They paid me the best and really cared about me as a person. I went through a lot with that family. I was caught smoking pot, and Mr. Crockett overlooked it. Then, when my son fell out of the tree, Jimmy stood by me and gave me the time I needed to deal with it. And when Jimmy Crockett was getting ready to rumble throughout Texas and the Southwest in 1988, he sent Jim Barnett to recruit me. I am proud that I was there with them when they closed down Crockett Promotions, and I can't say enough good things about them. After the sale, Ted Turner immediately put the wrestling company in the hands of Jim Herd, a former executive with Pizza Hut and TV studio manager who had no background or knowledge of wrestling. Jim Herd didn't even know who I was, and I had developed some of the biggest gimmicks and attractions in wrestling. He heard I was a manager and figured I was some guy who stood in the corner and pulled legs. I didn't take it personally though, because he didn't know who Dusty Rhodes was either. Jim Herd simply did not understand the power structure of professional wrestling, and had no comprehension of who the real players were. He was completely hoodwinked, and just took at face value what various wrestlers were telling him, allowing them to blow smoke up his ass and tell him how wonderful he was, when in reality, all they wanted was more money on their contract extensions. A lot of people started saying some very harsh things about Dusty Rhodes, complaining that he always booked himself on top. Those people never took into consideration that he was, at the time, one of the biggest box office attractions that wrestling ever had, and was at the top of his game. It would have been a disservice to everyone on the card to put Dusty underneath, because Dusty drew money, and everyone who worked on his cards made money. It's horrible the way people criticize Dusty even to this day. This thing with the Dusty finish? Come on. What about all the money he drew? All the great TV shows he produced? All the big shows he created? People are going to pick on him because he had a favorite finish. He had over 80 wrestlers and ran 3 towns a night all across America. Yes, sometimes a guy got double booked. Yes, sometimes a guy got left off the show. Yes, sometimes a guy might have been bumped from the corporate jet. When someone is booking on a national scale and producing as many television shows as Dusty did, it's very easy to find little things like that to try and demean his ability. However, there's a lot of pressure in running a wrestling company. I ran Texas for almost 7, and when I finished up I was mentally and physically exhausted just from the intensity of the workload that I had to produce. So as someone who has sat down and booked TV shows, made payoffs, ran towns, and understands the complicated problems that can come with running a wrestling company, I think Dusty Rhodes was an excellent booker. If you want to know the essence of who Dusty Rhodes is, this is it. He's a guy from Austin, Texas who made his way up through the ranks of wrestling, became a great box office attraction, a great booker, and a great TV producer. That's who Dusty Rhodes is, and anyone who would deny that has other reasons to not admitting it. I know that I'm coming off like a big Dusty Rhodes mark and that I'm taking his side, but I do think that people are very hard on him. Dusty was a guy that I had given a hand up to in 1968 when he was a young wrestler, and when I went to work for him in 1988, he took fabulous care of me and repaid anything I had ever done for him tenfold. When I would end a tour and wanted to go home to Daytona for 10 days to be with my family, it was no problem with Dusty. Working for him was as good as I had ever been treated, was as easy as I have ever had it, and I loved every second of it. Guys like Sting and Lex Luger never showed the appreciation and respect they owed to Dusty, because without him, they would have been nothing. Lex Luger is just some guy who was overpromoted by Dusty Rhodes, and could never live up to his hype. He never learned to work, and was never respectful of Dusty. And if you've watched one of Sting's matches, you've seen them all. People say that about Ric Flair, but that only happened after he became the world heavyweight champion, and he started working all around the country. When he was in the Carolinas earlier, every night was a different match. Plus, Rick was a great talent, and when he left the NWA, Sting and Lex Luger died, because he was the only one who could have a match with those 2 clumsy idiots. They would refer to Dusty as the whale and the fat guy behind his back, but when in his presence, they would beat the doors down to kiss his butt and act buddy-buddy with him. I thought that was the most hypocritical thing I ever witnessed. Believe me, Dusty knew what they were saying, but he didn't care. As long as they did what he told them to do in the ring, and as long as they contributed to the card, he couldn't have cared less what was being said behind his back. He never sat around and second-guessed himself because of what other people said about him. I'll tell you one thing about Dusty Rhodes: if you work for him and tell him you're unhappy, then ask him why he did something, he'll tell you. Then he'll say, if you don't like it you can leave. Or, you can get over it and stay. Ric Flair was another guy who never said anything nice about Dusty. There was constant turmoil between them, but over what? Rick was the champion. He was driving in limos, flying on Lear jets, and making $400,000 a year. What did he have to be upset about? The mere thought of Dusty wanting another brief run with the belt? A lot of guys came to the Carolinas driving old, beat-up cars, and after 4 years of Dusty's booking, they were all wearing Brioni suits, alligator shoes, and Rolex watches, living in big homes, driving Mercedes-Benz, Jaguars, Cadillacs, and Lincolns, carrying Louis Vuittons and Gucci's, and staying at the Hyatt rather than the Red Roof Inn. I had to sit and listen to all those guys say horrible things about Dusty. Why didn't they just look around and see the lifestyle that we were provided? Why didn't they remember that they came in driving a beat-up old Volkswagen and a broken-down Chevy? I'm not saying every guy was like that, but a lot of them were devoid of any respect. The wrestlers in Tennessee who worked for the Jarretts, they were mistreated. The wrestlers in San Antonio who worked for Joe Blanchard, they were mistreated. The wrestlers in Oklahoma who worked for Bill Watts, they were put on long trips and weren't paid very well. Most of the guys working for Jimmy Crockett when Dusty was the booker were making $250,000 a year, minimum. I wish somebody would mistreat me that way today. So whenever I hear people saying bad things about Dusty Rhodes, I just think it's sour grapes on their part. Unfortunately, by the time Jim Herd came in, there was so much negativity being thrown at Dusty that it seemed as if all the problems of the world were because of him, and if Dusty wasn't in the NWA, everything would be rosy. I got a call one day from Stanley Blackburn in Texas, telling me that Jim Herd was planning to let Dusty go. I actually didn't believe him, and told him it would be the worst possible move during this transitional time. Stanley seemed pretty positive that this was going to happen, because Jim Herd felt all the wrestlers were up in arms about him. A few days later, I saw Dusty in Kansas City, Missouri, and I called him off to the side, telling him, "Dusty, I heard a rumor that you might be let go." Dusty just brushed it off, saying, "I have a contract." I found out later that Stanley had heard the rumor from none other than Lou Thez. Jim Herd considered himself a great friend to Lou, but Lou just looked at Jim as some guy who had managed the television station where a wrestling tape had played on, and as someone he had gone out to dinner with a few times. Believe me, Lou Thez did not consider Jim Herd one of his tight friends. Dusty had no idea his firing was coming. Even with my warning, he was completely blindsided when it happened. All of the crybabies and whiners that Dusty had made rich and famous ganged up on him, went to Herd, and cut his nuts off. However, they had to bring him back eventually, didn't they?